Story number 1. The call from the past. The call came in at 11:57 p.m., just as I was about to end my shift. I was stationed at the desk that night, staring at a half-empty cup of cold coffee, my mind drifting toward the comfort of my bed. The phone rang, its sharp, mechanical tone slicing through the quiet of the precinct. I sighed, picked it up, and introduced myself with the usual, "Officer Miller, how can I help you?" The voice on the other end was frantic, a woman's voice. "Help! Please, you have to come quickly. They're here. They're in the house." "Ma'am, calm down," I said, sitting up straighter. "Where are you?" The address she gave froze me in place. It was 238 Willow Lane, a house that had been abandoned for 20 years. Everyone in town knew about it. It was the site of one of the most infamous murders in our area's history. The Peterson family, a father, mother, and 2 children, had been brutally killed in their home. No suspects were ever caught. The case was cold, the house left to rot. "Ma'am," I said carefully, "is this a joke?" "That house is." "They're coming," she screamed, cutting me off. Her voice was full of raw terror, and then the line went dead. I should have let it go. I should have written it off as a prank or some drunk messing around. But something about her voice, about the sheer desperation in it, stuck with me. Against my better judgment, I grabbed my coat and headed out into the cold night. Willow Lane was a short drive from the station, but the journey felt endless. The street was deserted, shrouded in fog that clung to the ground like a living thing. When I pulled up to 238, the house loomed before me, a decaying monument to tragedy. Its windows were dark, its porch sagging, the front door hanging slightly ajar. I stepped out of the car, my flashlight cutting through the thick mist, and approached the house. The air felt wrong, heavy and electric, as if the atmosphere itself was holding its breath. I pushed the door open, the hinges groaning in protest. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing through the empty halls. "This is Officer Miller. I got a call from this address. Is anyone here?" Silence answered me, but not the kind of silence you expect in an abandoned house. This was thick and oppressive, like the house itself was listening. I stepped inside, my flashlight sweeping over faded wallpaper and dust-covered furniture. The air smelled of mildew and something faintly metallic. Blood, maybe. The first thing I noticed was the phone. It was an old rotary model, sitting on a side table in the foyer. It shouldn't have worked. There was no electricity in the house, but the receiver was hanging off the hook, the cord swinging slightly as if someone had just put it down. That's when I heard the first scream. It came from upstairs, a high-pitched, piercing sound that sent a shiver down my spine. I drew my gun and called out again. "This is the police. If someone's in here, make yourself known." The only response was another scream, louder this time, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps running overhead. I took the stairs 2 at a time, my boots thudding against the worn wood. The hallway at the top was dark, lined with closed doors. The air was colder here, each breath visible in the faint beam of my flashlight. Another scream came, this one from the farthest room on the right. I moved toward it, my heart pounding, every instinct screaming at me to turn back. When I opened the door, I stepped into chaos. The room was lit, but not by any light I could explain. It was a soft, flickering glow, like candlelight, but there were no candles. A family sat at a dinner table, frozen in time. The father's head was slumped forward, blood pooling on the table beneath him. The mother's eyes were wide with terror, her hands clutching her throat as if trying to stop an invisible attack. The 2 children sat motionless, their faces pale, their bodies twisted unnaturally. And then they moved. It was subtle at first, a twitch of the mother's hand, the slow turn of the father's head. The children's eyes snapped open, their blank gazes locking onto mine. I stumbled back, the flashlight shaking in my hand. "What the hell?" I whispered. The mother stood, her movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet on strings. Her mouth opened, but the scream that came out didn't match her face. It was the same scream I'd heard on the phone. "You have to stop them," she shrieked. "They're here. There." The room shifted around me. One moment, I was standing in the dining room, the next, I was in a dark hallway. I could hear them, footsteps, whispers, the low hum of something vast and unknowable. The house wasn't just a house. It was alive, and it was pulling me deeper. I stumbled through room after room, each one more distorted than the last. The furniture was wrong, the angles of the walls impossible, like I'd stepped into a dream that was decaying around me. The family appeared in flashes, a reflection in a dusty mirror, a shadow at the edge of my flashlight beam, the mother's voice echoing through the halls, "Help us." I don't know how long I wandered before I found myself back in the foyer. The phone was ringing again, its shrill tone cutting through the oppressive silence. I hesitated, then picked it up. "Hello?" "You can't leave," the voice said. It was the father's voice now, low and rough, like gravel. "You're part of it." The line went dead, and the door slammed shut behind me. I turned, my flashlight flickering as the shadows in the room began to move. They stretched and twisted, forming shapes that were almost human but not quite. The family stood in the doorway to the dining room, their eyes glowing faintly. "You should have stayed away," the mother said, her voice layered with something ancient and cruel. The father stepped forward, his movements slow and deliberate. "Time doesn't work here," he said. "You can't change it. You can only watch." And then the house pulled me in. I don't know how long I've been here. Days, weeks, years, it all blurs together. The house makes me watch the same night over and over, the night the Petersons died. I see them scream, see the blood, see the terror in their eyes. And then it starts again. Sometimes, I see myself in the photos on the walls, standing in the background, watching. Sometimes, I hear my own voice on the phone, calling for help that will never come. The house has me now, and it won't let go. If you ever hear about 238 Willow Lane, if someone dares you to visit, don't. Let it rot. Let it fade into history. Because once you step inside, you're already part of it. Story number 2. The Woman on the Highway. It was one of those nights where the world seemed to hold its breath. The highway stretched endlessly ahead, a thin ribbon of asphalt cutting through dense, silent woods. I was sitting in the passenger seat of the rescue truck, sipping coffee that had gone cold hours ago, when the call came in. A single, chilling report: "There's a woman on the highway. She's hurt." The voice on the line was panicked, breathless, and then gone before dispatch could ask for more details. We reached the location a little past midnight. The spot was remote, miles from the nearest town, with nothing but towering trees on either side. Our headlights pierced the darkness, and there she was, standing in the middle of the road. At first glance, she looked like any other accident victim, her clothes torn and bloodied, her hair matted. She was barefoot, her feet dirty and scratched, and she didn't seem to notice the chill in the air. She turned slowly as we approached, her face illuminated in the harsh glare of the truck's lights. Something about her wasn't right. Her skin was pale, too pale, and her movements were unnaturally fluid, like a marionette guided by invisible strings. Her eyes locked onto mine as we got out of the truck, and for a moment, I swore they glinted red. She didn't speak, just pointed toward the forest, her finger trembling slightly. "Ma'am, are you hurt?" I asked, my voice steady despite the knot tightening in my gut. She didn't answer. Instead, she started walking, her bare feet making no sound on the cold pavement. She moved with purpose, glancing over her shoulder as if to make sure we were following. Against every instinct screaming at me to stop, I followed her. My partner, Dale, muttered under his breath, but he came too. Maybe it was the way she walked, or the sheer wrongness of the situation, but neither of us could seem to turn back. The forest swallowed us whole. The air was colder here, heavy with the scent of damp earth and decay. The woman moved ahead of us, her figure barely visible in the faint light of our flashlights. The trees pressed in around us, their branches clawing at the sky. It felt as though the forest was alive, watching, waiting. "Ma'am, where are we going?" Dale called out, his voice shaky. Still, she didn't answer. She just kept walking, deeper and deeper into the woods. Then we saw it. A clearing opened before us, and in the center stood the wreckage of a car. It was an old sedan, its roof caved in, the windows shattered. The metal was rusted, as though it had been sitting there for decades, but the blood splattered across the hood looked fresh. The woman stopped next to the car, her hand resting on the crumpled door. Her head tilted slightly, as if listening to something only she could hear. "This isn't right," Dale said, his voice barely above a whisper. "This doesn't make sense." And then she spoke. "They left me here," she said, her voice soft but cutting through the silence like a knife. "They left me to die." "Who?" I asked, my mouth dry. "Who left you?" She turned to face us, and in that moment, the last shred of doubt left my mind. This wasn't a woman. Her eyes were black voids, her skin stretched too tight over her bones. Her smile was wrong, too wide, showing too many teeth. "They all left," she said, taking a step toward us. "And now you're here." The forest came alive around us. Shadows moved among the trees, shapes that didn't belong to anything human. The air was filled with whispers, low and guttural, words in a language I couldn't understand. Dale grabbed my arm, his flashlight shaking in his hand. "We need to go," he said, his voice barely audible. But the woman was faster. She moved with inhuman speed, blocking the path back to the highway. "You can't leave," she said, her voice layered with something ancient and cruel. "Not yet." The shadows closed in, their forms shifting and flickering at the edge of the light. I could feel them pressing against my skin, cold and suffocating. The woman raised her hand, and the whispers grew louder, turning into screams. The wrecked car groaned, its metal twisting and screeching as if something inside it was trying to break free. I don't remember how we got out. One moment, we were surrounded, the forest alive with malice, the woman's empty eyes fixed on us. The next, we were back on the highway, gasping for air. The truck's engine roared to life as Dale floored it, and we didn't stop until we were miles away. We didn't talk about what happened. Not to each other, not to anyone. But I can't forget her. Every night, I hear her voice, soft and accusing, "They left me here. And now you're here." I've looked into the history of that stretch of highway. There was an accident there, 20 years ago. A young woman was killed, her body left in the wreckage of her car for days before anyone found her. The driver who hit her never stopped, never came forward. They say she haunts the highway, luring the living into the woods where she died. I don't know why she let us go. Maybe it was a warning, or maybe she's waiting for the right moment to finish what she started. All I know is this: if you're ever driving down that highway at night and you see a woman standing in the road, don't stop. Don't follow her. Because once you do, you might never come back. Story number 3. The Drowned Below. The river was calm the night we got the call. The surface reflected the moonlight in silvery ripples, peaceful and deceptive. It didn't match the urgency in the dispatcher's voice. A car had veered off the road and into the water. The driver was missing, and time was running out. As part of the regional dive rescue team, this was our job, the kind of call we'd handled countless times. But something about that night felt wrong from the start. The scene was already crowded when we arrived. Flashing lights from police cruisers and an ambulance painted the nearby trees in shades of blue and red. The road by the riverbank was slick with mud and rain, tire tracks veering dangerously close to the edge. A young officer approached us, his face pale under the harsh lights. "The car went in just over there," he said, pointing to a section of the river where the current moved slower, swirling like a lazy serpent. No sign of anyone getting out. We suited up quickly, the weight of our gear a familiar, grounding sensation. My partner, Grant, shot me a look as we prepared to dive. "You feel it?" he asked, his voice low enough that only I could hear. I nodded. There was a tension in the air, a heaviness that pressed down on my chest. It wasn't fear, exactly, but an instinctual sense that something wasn't right. The water was cold, biting even through the layers of our suits. Visibility was poor, the murky depths swallowing the beam of my flashlight after just a few feet. Grant swam ahead, his movements deliberate and practiced. We descended slowly, the surface fading above us until it was just a faint shimmer. It didn't take long to find the car. At first, I thought it was the one we were looking for. It sat tilted on the riverbed, its front end buried in silt, its windows dark and broken. But as I got closer, I realized it wasn't new. The metal was rusted, the paint stripped away by years underwater. This car had been here a long time. "Grant," I said through the comms, my voice muffled by the regulator. "This can't be it." He swam closer, his flashlight cutting through the gloom. "This thing's ancient," he muttered. "What the hell is it doing here?" That's when I saw it. The shadow. It flickered at the edge of the light, too large to be a fish, too fast to be anything else. I froze, my heart hammering against my ribs. "Did you see that?" I asked, my voice shaking. "See what?" Grant replied, his light sweeping the area. There was nothing there now, just the murky water and the silent car. We moved closer, the silt kicking up around us as we approached the vehicle. The driver's side door hung open, the interior a mess of tangled weeds and mud. But there was something else, too. A handprint on the window, perfectly preserved despite the years. It was small, delicate, like a child's. "Grant, we need to surface," I said, pulling back. "Hold on," he said, his voice tense. "There's something inside." I watched as he shone his light through the shattered window. His breathing hitched, and I knew he saw it too. A face. Pale and lifeless, staring back at us from the darkness. But it wasn't just one face. As Grant moved the light, more appeared, pressing against the glass, their eyes hollow, their mouths open in silent screams. "Get back!" I shouted, but it was too late. The hands came first, pale and clawed, reaching out of the car and wrapping around Grant's arm. He thrashed, his flashlight spinning wildly as more hands emerged, dragging him closer to the vehicle. I lunged forward, grabbing his other arm, but the pull was too strong. The faces in the car were clearer now, their features twisted with rage and desperation. "They're pulling me in!" Grant screamed, his voice crackling through the comms. "Help me!" I kicked against the current, using all my strength to pull him free. For a moment, it felt like I was winning. But then one of the hands grabbed my leg, cold and impossibly strong, and I felt myself being dragged toward the car. The whispers started then, soft and insistent, echoing in my head. "Join us. Stay with us. We're so lonely." I fought against them, against the pull of the car and the voices in my mind. My flashlight caught a glimpse of something inside the vehicle, a woman, her face half decayed, her eyes locked onto mine. She was mouthing something, but it wasn't in time with the whispers. It was different, a warning. "Leave." I let go of Grant, kicking free of the hands that held me. I turned to see him fighting too, his movements frantic. Somehow, he broke free, the hands retreating back into the car as if they'd been burned. We didn't wait. We swam for the surface, the light above us growing brighter with every stroke. When we broke through the surface, gasping for air, the night was eerily quiet. The emergency vehicles were gone. The police, the ambulance, the bystanders, all of them had vanished. Even our truck was missing. We dragged ourselves onto the muddy bank, collapsing in exhaustion. Grant was shaking, his eyes wide with fear. "What the hell was that?" he whispered. I didn't have an answer. The next morning, when we reported what had happened, no one believed us. The dispatcher claimed there had been no call, no report of a car in the river. When we checked the spot where we'd found the vehicle, there was nothing there. No car, no handprints, no faces. Just the slow, silent flow of the river. But I can still hear them sometimes, in the dead of night. The whispers. They're softer now, but they're always there, calling from the depths. And I know, one day, they'll pull me back. Because the river doesn't let go. Not really. Story number 4. Shadows in the woods. When the call came in, the sun was already dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows across the dense forest of Black Hollow National Park. A group of campers, 5 in total, had gone missing. They were last seen 3 days ago, venturing deep into the park despite the warnings of bad weather and rough terrain. By the time their families reported them missing, a storm had rolled through, making the search all the more difficult. I was part of the rescue team sent to find them, a mix of park rangers and volunteers, all seasoned in tracking and search operations. None of us were prepared for what we found. The first signs were subtle. A tattered piece of cloth caught on a tree branch, a discarded water bottle half buried in mud. We followed the trail deeper into the forest, our radios crackling with intermittent updates from other search teams. The air was heavy, the kind of oppressive weight that presses down on your chest and makes every breath feel labored. The forest was eerily quiet, the usual chorus of birds and insects conspicuously absent. It felt like the trees were listening, watching. As night fell, we set up camp near a clearing. The group was uneasy, though no one said it outright. Something about the forest felt wrong, like it wasn't just empty, it was waiting. One of the volunteers, a guy named Carter, joked about the legends surrounding Black Hollow. Stories of ghostly figures seen flitting between the trees, whispers that carried on the wind, shadows that moved on their own. We all laughed it off, but the laughter didn't last long. The first real sign of trouble came just before midnight. I was on watch, sitting near the fire, when I heard it, a faint voice, almost too soft to catch. It was coming from the trees, a whisper that rose and fell like the rustle of leaves. I stood, my flashlight cutting through the darkness, but there was nothing there. Just the trees, their bare branches clawing at the sky. "Did you hear that?" I asked, shaking Carter awake. He rubbed his eyes, groggy and annoyed. "Hear what?" Before I could answer, the whisper came again, louder this time. It was a voice, clear and unmistakable, calling my name. Carter heard it too. His face paled, his hand instinctively reaching for the rifle slung over his shoulder. "What the hell is that?" he muttered. The others woke up one by one, drawn by the sound. We stood in a circle, flashlights scanning the trees, but the voice was gone. We didn't sleep much after that. The next day, we found the cabin. It was tucked away in a dense thicket, almost completely hidden by overgrown vines and moss. The wood was rotting, the windows shattered, but there were signs of recent activity. Footprints in the mud, a faint trail of smoke from the rusted chimney. It didn't make sense. The area wasn't on any map, and there was no record of a cabin being built this far out. We approached cautiously, weapons drawn, but the place seemed empty. Inside, the air was stale and cold, filled with the scent of mildew and decay. The walls were covered in strange markings, symbols carved deep into the wood. They looked ancient, primitive, but none of us could decipher their meaning. In the center of the room was a table, and on it, a journal. The pages were brittle and yellowed with age, filled with shaky handwriting that grew more frantic as it went on. The entries spoke of shadows that moved without light, of whispers that called out in the night, of a presence in the woods that watched and waited. The final entry read, "They're here. They're always here. Don't listen to the whispers. Don't look into the shadows. Don't let them see you." We should have left then, but curiosity got the better of us. We decided to split up, searching the area for any sign of the missing campers. That was our first mistake. The forest felt different now. The air was colder, the shadows darker. I was with Carter, moving slowly through the underbrush, when we saw it, a figure standing between the trees. It was too far to make out any details, but it was watching us. "Hey!" Carter called out, raising his rifle. The figure didn't move. We stepped closer, the leaves crunching underfoot, but when we reached the spot where it had been, there was nothing there. Just empty forest. That's when the screams started. They came from the direction of the cabin, high-pitched and panicked. Carter and I ran back as fast as we could, the forest seeming to close in around us. When we reached the clearing, the others were gone. Their gear was scattered, their flashlights lying in the dirt, but there was no sign of them. We searched for hours, calling their names, but the only response was the whispers. They were louder now, coming from every direction, echoing through the trees. And then we saw the shadows. At first, they were just flickers, movements at the edge of our vision. But they grew bolder, darker, until they surrounded us. They didn't have faces, just voids where eyes and mouths should have been. They moved without sound, their forms shifting and twisting like smoke. Carter fired his rifle, the sound shattering the stillness, but it didn't matter. The shadows weren't physical. They couldn't be hurt. One of them reached for him, its hand stretching unnaturally, and Carter screamed. I tried to pull him away, but it was like he was rooted to the ground. The shadow enveloped him, and then he was gone. I ran. The forest was a maze, the trees all looking the same, but somehow I found my way back to the cabin. The whispers were deafening now, overlapping voices that seemed to come from inside my own head. I barricaded the door and sat in the corner, clutching the journal like a talisman. The shadows pressed against the windows, their forms writhing. I closed my eyes, reciting the words from the journal over and over. Don't listen to the whispers. Don't look into the shadows. Don't let them see you. I don't remember how I got out. One moment, I was in the cabin, the shadows closing in. The next, I was on the edge of the forest, the sun rising in the distance. The search team found me hours later, disoriented and alone. The others were never found. Now, whenever I close my eyes, I see them. The shadows. They're always there, just out of reach, waiting. And I can still hear the whispers, soft and insistent, calling me back to the woods. One day, I know I'll go. And this time, I won't come out. Story number 5. The Empty Cell. It was supposed to be an ordinary night shift. Quiet. Uneventful. The kind of night that makes you hate the job for its monotony. I'd been working the desk at the station for years, and Friday nights in our small town rarely brought more than a couple of drunk drivers or domestic disputes. But that night, God, that night was different. That was the night we brought him in. The call came in just after 10. A shopkeeper downtown reported a man loitering outside his store, mumbling to himself and scaring off customers. Nothing unusual about that. We got plenty of drifters passing through, and most of them were harmless. Still, the shopkeeper sounded shaken, so I grabbed my jacket and headed out. When I got there, the man was standing under the flickering light of a street lamp, his back to me. He was tall, almost unnaturally so, with long, lanky limbs that didn't seem to fit his frame. His coat hung loosely on his shoulders, frayed at the edges, and his hands were shoved deep into his pockets. As I approached, he turned to face me, and I felt a chill run down my spine. There was something wrong with his eyes. They were too dark, like the pupils swallowed the iris entirely. He smiled when he saw me, but it wasn't the kind of smile you'd expect. It was too wide, too sharp, as if he was trying to mimic an expression he didn't fully understand. "Sir," I said, keeping my voice steady, "we've had some complaints. I'm going to need you to come with me." He didn't answer, just tilted his head slightly, like a curious animal. Then, without warning, he lunged. I barely had time to react, fumbling for my baton as he grabbed at me. His grip was ice cold, and stronger than it should have been. But he wasn't trying to hurt me. He just stared, his face inches from mine, his breath reeking of something metallic. Then he whispered, so low I almost didn't hear it, "You can't hold me." I managed to wrestle him into cuffs, though it took more effort than I cared to admit. He didn't resist after that, just stood there, smiling that eerie smile as I loaded him into the squad car. The drive back to the station was silent, the only sound the occasional rustle of his coat as he shifted in his seat. When we arrived, I booked him for disturbing the peace. He gave no name, no address, no ID. I put him in the last cell at the end of the hall, cell 6. It was the smallest, coldest cell in the station, but he didn't seem to mind. He just sat on the cot, staring at the wall, humming a tune I didn't recognize. By the time I finished the paperwork, it was nearly midnight. I went back to check on him, but when I reached the cell, he was gone. At first, I thought it was a mistake. Maybe I'd miscounted the cells, or maybe one of the other officers had moved him without telling me. But the door was locked, the key still hanging on my belt. There was no way he could have gotten out. That's when I noticed the symbols. They were etched into the walls of the cell, deep grooves that hadn't been there before. Strange, angular shapes that seemed to shift and writhe if I looked at them too long. My chest tightened as I stepped closer, running my fingers over the marks. They felt warm, almost alive, as if the stone itself was breathing. I called the chief, my voice shaking as I explained what had happened. He was skeptical, of course, but when he arrived and saw the empty cell and the symbols, his face turned pale. "What the hell is this?" he muttered, tracing one of the marks with his flashlight. "I don't know," I said. He was just gone. We searched the entire station, top to bottom, but there was no sign of the man. The cameras in the hallway showed nothing, just static during the time he would have disappeared. The symbols, though, they were clear as day. The chief wanted to call in an expert, maybe someone from the university, but the mayor shut it down. Too much attention, he said. Last thing we need is a bunch of reporters swarming the station. So the symbols were scrubbed off the walls, and the incident was quietly forgotten. Officially, at least. But I couldn't forget. I started having nightmares, visions of those symbols, glowing and pulsating, calling to me. In the dreams, I was back in the cell, the walls closing in, the man's voice whispering in my ear, "You can't hold me." It got worse. I started seeing him, on the street, in the reflection of my rearview mirror, standing at the edge of my yard at night. Always smiling, always watching. I tried to ignore it, but the more I did, the closer he seemed to get. One night, I woke to find the symbols carved into the walls of my bedroom. They weren't as deep as the ones in the cell, but they were there, glowing faintly in the dark. I scrubbed them off, but they came back the next night, and the night after that. I started sleeping in the living room, but it didn't help. The symbols followed me, appearing on the furniture, the floors, even my skin. I don't know what he was, or what he wanted. All I know is that he wasn't human. Maybe he never was. The symbols, whatever they mean, they're not just marks. They're a message. A warning. A promise. I'm writing this now because I don't think I have much time left. The symbols are everywhere now, and I can hear his voice again, louder this time. He's coming for me. If you ever find yourself near cell 6, don't go inside. And if you see a man with 2 dark eyes and a too wide smile, run. Because once he chooses you, there's no escape. You can't hold him. But he can hold you. Story number 6. The Cry on the Bridge. I was driving home after another long shift at the station, the clock on the dashboard blinking 2:17 a.m. The road was deserted, shrouded in the kind of darkness that swallows everything outside the reach of your headlights. I was halfway across the old Miller Bridge when I heard it, the sound of a child crying. At first, I thought it was the wind. The bridge was ancient, its rusted metal and weathered wood groaning with every passing breeze. But then it came again, louder this time, piercing the stillness of the night. It was unmistakable. A child, sobbing, somewhere nearby. I pulled over, my tires crunching on the gravel shoulder. As a rescue worker, it was in my blood to help. Even though every instinct screamed at me to stay in the truck, I couldn't ignore the sound. Grabbing my flashlight, I stepped out into the cold night air. The bridge loomed above the river, its skeletal frame illuminated by the faint glow of my headlights. The crying continued, softer now, as if the child was moving further away. I scanned the area, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. That's when I saw it, a small figure standing at the edge of the bridge. It was a child, no older than 7 or 8, wearing a drenched white dress that clung to her tiny frame. Her hair hung in wet tangles around her face, and her bare feet were smeared with mud. She didn't move, didn't even flinch as I approached. "Hey there," I called out, keeping my voice calm. "Are you okay? Are you hurt?" She didn't respond. Her head turned slightly, and for the briefest moment, I thought I saw her smile, a faint, eerie curve of her lips that sent a chill down my spine. I shook it off. She was just a scared kid, probably lost. I needed to help her. "It's okay," I said, taking another step closer. "I'm here to help. Let's get you out of the cold, all right?" That's when she turned to face me fully, and my breath caught in my throat. Her eyes, oh God, her eyes were empty, 2 black voids that seemed to swallow the light of my flashlight. Water dripped from her hands, her dress, pooling at her feet in an unnatural rhythm. Before I could react, she raised one hand and pointed toward the river below. I don't know why I looked. Curiosity? Fear? Something I couldn't explain compelled me to follow her gesture. Peering over the edge of the bridge, I saw it, the reflection. It wasn't me. It wasn't her. It was something else entirely. A distorted, grotesque shape that writhed and pulsed in the water, its form barely human. Before I could pull back, something grabbed my wrist. The girl's hand was like ice, her grip impossibly strong for someone so small. She didn't speak, but her mouth moved, forming words I couldn't hear. The next thing I knew, I was falling. The water hit me like a freight train, freezing and suffocating all at once. My flashlight slipped from my grasp, its beam disappearing into the murky depths. I kicked and thrashed, trying to find the surface, but the current was too strong. My lungs burned as I fought for air, panic clawing at the edges of my mind. And then I saw them. Faces, dozens of them, just beneath the surface. Children, their eyes black like the girl's, their mouths open in silent screams. They reached for me, their hands cold and claw-like, dragging me deeper. I tried to scream, but the river filled my mouth, choking the sound. Just when I thought I would black out, I felt myself break the surface. Gasping for air, I clawed my way to the riverbank, my body trembling with cold and fear. I collapsed onto the muddy shore, coughing up water and bile. When I finally looked up, the girl was standing there, watching me. She didn't move, didn't speak. She just stared, her black eyes glinting in the moonlight. "You shouldn't have come," she said at last, her voice soft and echoing, like it was coming from somewhere far away. What are you?" I managed to choke out. Her smile widened, and for a moment, her face twisted into something monstrous, her mouth too wide, her teeth sharp and jagged. "We were forgotten," she said. "But now you remember us. And we remember you." Before I could react, she disappeared, her form dissolving into the mist. The crying started again, faint and distant, fading as the night grew silent once more. I stumbled back to my truck, my mind racing. By the time I reached the station, it was dawn. I tried to explain what had happened, but no one believed me. The river was searched, but no bodies were found. No children had been reported missing. It was as if the night had swallowed the entire incident whole. But I can't forget. The girl's eyes haunt me every time I close my own, and the whispers, those soft, insistent whispers, follow me wherever I go. They call me back to the bridge, to the river, to the faces waiting below. One day, I know I'll have to go. Because once you hear the crying, it never really stops. It's always there, waiting, just like they are. Story number 7. The house that burned forever. It was a call like any other. A fire reported at the old Wexler house, a sprawling Victorian relic that had stood on the edge of town for over a century. It was a known eyesore, its windows boarded up, the paint peeling in long, curling strips. The locals had 100 stories about the place, none of them good. But fire didn't care about ghost stories, and neither did we. When the alarm sounded, we suited up and headed out. The night was cold, the kind that bites through your gear and sinks into your bones. As our truck roared down the empty streets, the glow of the fire appeared on the horizon, flickering against the dark silhouette of the house. By the time we arrived, the flames were licking hungrily at the second floor, their orange light dancing in the broken windows. "Let's move," Captain Hayes barked, his voice cutting through the crackle of the fire. We grabbed our tools and headed in. I was paired with Jackson, a rookie who'd only been on the job for a couple of months. He was eager but green, his hands trembling slightly as we approached the front door. The air was thick with smoke, the acrid stench of burning wood and something else, something metallic and sour, filling my lungs. Inside, the house was a maze of narrow hallways and cluttered rooms. The fire seemed to pulse with a strange rhythm, almost like it was alive, its glow casting long, twisted shadows on the walls. We moved quickly, sweeping each room for any signs of life. But the place was empty. At least, it should have been. That's when I heard it. A voice. Faint at first, but unmistakable. It was coming from upstairs, a soft, high-pitched whisper that sent a chill down my spine. "Help me," it said. "Please, help me." "Jackson, you hear that?" I asked, my voice muffled by the mask. He nodded, his eyes wide. "Yeah. It's coming from up there." We climbed the staircase, each step groaning under our weight. The fire seemed to retreat as we moved, the flames shrinking back into the walls as if leading us deeper into the house. The air grew colder, the smoke thinner, but the voice grew louder. We found the source in a bedroom at the end of the hall. The room was untouched by fire, its walls lined with faded wallpaper, the bed neatly made. But standing in the corner, illuminated by the beam of Jackson's flashlight, was a figure. A girl, no older than 10, her hair matted and her dress scorched and tattered. She turned to look at us, and I froze. Her eyes were wrong. They were dark, empty pits, and her face was twisted in an expression of pure anguish. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered, her voice layered with something deeper, something ancient. Before I could react, the door slammed shut behind us, and the room was swallowed in darkness. When the light returned, we weren't in the same house. The walls were blackened, the floor beneath our feet charred and unstable. The air was stifling, heavy with the choking scent of ash. "What the hell just happened?" Jackson stammered, his voice cracking with fear. "I don't know," I admitted, trying to steady my breathing. "Stay close." We moved cautiously, retracing our steps, but the house had changed. The hallways were longer now, twisting and turning in impossible ways. The fire was everywhere, but it didn't behave like any fire I'd ever seen. It didn't consume the house. It moved with purpose, blocking our path, forcing us deeper into the labyrinth. And then the whispers started. Low and guttural, like voices carried on the wind. They came from the walls, the floor, the very air around us. "They burned us," the voices said. "They watched us burn." We stumbled into a room that looked like a dining hall. The table was set with plates of blackened food, the chairs scorched and brittle. But the most horrifying thing was the figure seated at the table. They were charred corpses, their flesh cracked and blackened, their mouths frozen in silent screams. As we stood there, paralyzed, their heads turned in unison to look at us. "Run!" I shouted, grabbing Jackson's arm. We bolted down another hallway, the flames closing in behind us. The whispers grew louder, overlapping until they became a deafening roar. "You have to burn," they screamed. "You have to burn like we did." We burst into another room, slamming the door behind us. This one was small, a bedroom with a single, soot-covered bed. Jackson was breathing heavily, his hands shaking as he gripped his axe. "What's happening?" he whispered. "This isn't real. It can't be real." But it was. The house was alive, and it wasn't going to let us leave. I don't know how long we wandered. Time didn't feel real in that place. The fire never consumed us, but it was always there, always watching. The whispers never stopped, their words carving themselves into my mind. We saw things, visions of people trapped in the flames, their faces twisted in agony. And the girl. She was always there, just out of reach, her hollow eyes staring, her scorched hands beckoning us forward. When we finally found the exit, it felt like a miracle. The front door stood open, the night air visible just beyond it. Jackson and I didn't hesitate. We ran, bursting out onto the lawn, collapsing onto the cool grass. The house loomed behind us, its windows glowing with an unnatural light. For a moment, I thought we were safe. Then Jackson started screaming. I turned to see him clawing at his chest, his skin blistering as if he were on fire. I tried to help him, but it was no use. The flames consumed him, leaving nothing but ash that blew away in the wind. And then I was alone. The house still stands. It didn't burn that night, and no one believes what I saw. The official report says we found nothing unusual, that the fire had burned itself out by the time we arrived. Jackson is listed as missing, his name etched into the memorial wall at the station. But I know the truth. The house is alive. It feeds on guilt, on fear, on the sins of the past. It burned once, a long time ago, and it's been burning ever since. And the souls trapped inside? They'll never stop calling for help. I can still hear them sometimes, in my dreams. The whispers. The screams. The sound of fire that never dies. And I know one day, it will call me back. Because the house isn't done with me. Not yet. Story number 8. Faceless. It started with a call just before dawn, the kind of call no cop ever wants to get. Single car accident, dispatch said. Out on Route 12. Fatality. I was already pulling on my uniform before the line went dead. Fatalities on that stretch of road weren't rare. It was a straight shot through miles of empty farmland, but it was pitch black at night, with no lights and plenty of blind curves. Drunk drivers loved it, and the occasional animal crossing made it a death trap. I expected a mangled car and the usual grim routine. What I got was something else entirely. The scene was easy to spot, blue and red lights flashing against the gray dawn, a patrol car idling on the side of the road. Officer Jennings waved me over, his face pale and drawn. "You're not going to believe this one," he said as I stepped out of my cruiser. The car was a crumpled mess, its front end wrapped around an old oak tree. Steam hissed from the radiator, and the air reeked of gasoline and burnt rubber. But the wreck wasn't what caught my attention. It was the body. The victim was slumped over the wheel, blood pooling on the cracked leather seat. But their face, there wasn't one. Where eyes, a nose, and a mouth should have been, there was only smooth, featureless skin, like a mannequin. My stomach turned as I stepped closer, my flashlight trembling in my hand. "What the hell happened here?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Jennings shook his head, his hand hovering near his gun like it might protect him from whatever this was. "Driver's license says his name was Tom Whitaker. 32. Local. But, look at him. How do you even explain that?" I couldn't. The body was perfectly intact, except for the face. No burns, no injuries, no sign of tampering. It was as if the man's features had simply been erased. I snapped a few photos, my hands shaking, before radioing for the coroner. "Let's wrap this up," Jennings muttered, glancing nervously at the tree line. "This whole place feels wrong." The next few days were a blur of paperwork and unanswered questions. The coroner's report came back inconclusive. No signs of trauma, no drugs or alcohol in the victim's system. The face? Unexplainable anatomical anomaly. That was the official phrasing. Privately, the coroner told me she'd never seen anything like it. "It's like he wasn't finished," she said, her voice hushed. "Like someone started making him and gave up halfway. The case should have ended there, filed away as one more unsolved mystery. But it didn't. It followed me. The first time it happened, I was sitting at my desk, staring at the crime scene photos. My office was dim, lit only by the glow of my desk lamp. I'd gone over the photos a dozen times, searching for anything that might make sense of what I'd seen. That's when I noticed it, a reflection in the cracked windshield of the wrecked car. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, a trick of the light. But as I zoomed in, my blood ran cold. There was a face in the reflection. Not the victim's. Mine. I pushed back from my desk, my chair scraping against the floor. The photo was still there, staring back at me, my own reflection distorted and twisted in the shattered glass. I slammed the file shut, my heart pounding. But even then, I felt it, the sensation of being watched. The faceless started appearing soon after that. It began on my commute home, late at night. The road was empty, the fields on either side shrouded in darkness. I was halfway across the old bridge when I saw them. Figures standing on the side of the road, their silhouettes barely visible in the moonlight. They didn't move, didn't acknowledge the car as I passed. But I saw enough to know they were like the victim, smooth, featureless faces staring at me, or through me. I drove faster, my hands gripping the wheel tight enough to make my knuckles ache. By the time I got home, I was drenched in sweat. But the worst was yet to come. The dreams were the hardest to bear. Night after night, I found myself back at the crash site. The wreckage was the same, but the victim was missing. In their place stood the faceless, their blank heads tilting as if they could see me. They whispered, soft and insistent, words I couldn't understand but felt in my bones. "Help us. Find us." I woke up gasping, my sheets soaked and my heart racing. The whispers lingered, faint but unmistakable, even after I was awake. They followed me to work, to the grocery store, to every corner of my life. And the faceless followed too. I started seeing them everywhere. At the end of aisles in the supermarket, standing motionless on street corners, reflected in windows as I passed. No one else seemed to notice them, or if they did, they said nothing. I tried to ignore them, but it was impossible. They were always there, watching, waiting. It wasn't until I returned to the crash site that I began to understand. The tree where the car had crashed was old, its bark scarred from decades of lightning strikes and storms. But now, there were markings carved into the wood, symbols I didn't recognize, deep grooves that bled sap like tears. As I traced the symbols with my fingers, the whispers grew louder, clearer. "Find us!" A flash of light caught my eye, and I turned to see the reflection in the car's windshield again. This time, it wasn't my face staring back. It was the victim's, or what should have been their face. Their blank, featureless head tilted toward the river below the bridge. I followed the gesture, my flashlight cutting through the dark. The water was still, its surface glassy under the moonlight. But as I stared, shapes began to form. Faces, dozens of them, just beneath the surface, their mouths open in silent screams. The truth hit me like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just a crash site. It was a graveyard. The victims, their faces stolen, their identities erased, they were still here, trapped, waiting for someone to see them, to remember them. I don't know how long I stood there, staring into the water. Long enough for the whispers to fade, for the faceless to disappear into the night. When I finally tore myself away, the first rays of dawn were breaking over the horizon. The case remains unsolved. The official report lists the cause of death as undetermined. The faceless still appear from time to time, but they no longer frighten me. They watch, but they don't harm. They're waiting for something, someone, to set them free. If you ever find yourself driving down Route 12 at night and see figures standing by the road, don't stop. Don't look. Because once you see them, they'll see you too. And they'll never let you go. Story number 9. The Phantom Car. The night started like any other. A stretch of quiet highways, the occasional call about a stray deer or a stalled vehicle, nothing that suggested the kind of horror waiting for us. I was partnered with Officer Frank Carter, a seasoned cop with a penchant for chewing tobacco and telling stories that walked the line between plausible and absurd. He was mid-tale about some haunted barn he swore he saw as a rookie when the call came through. "Abandoned vehicle," dispatch said. "Route 17, near mile marker 43. Witness claims it's blocking the road." We groaned in unison. Abandoned cars were routine, usually someone running out of gas or a joyride gone sour. But the witness had mentioned something strange. The car's headlights were on, and the engine seemed to be running, though no one was inside. Frank shrugged it off, but I felt an uneasy tug in my gut as we pulled onto Route 17. The car was hard to miss. It sat in the middle of the road, a 1960s muscle car, pristine despite the rain slicking the asphalt. Its headlights pierced the darkness, the low hum of the idling engine cutting through the quiet. It looked like it had rolled right off the showroom floor, down to the gleaming chrome bumpers and the polished black paint that reflected the moonlight like liquid obsidian. Frank let out a low whistle. "They don't make M like that anymore. What the hell is it doing out here?" We stepped out of the cruiser, our flashlights cutting arcs through the mist. The air felt heavier than usual, pressing down on my chest. I approached the driver's side cautiously, but the car's interior was empty. The door was unlocked, and when I opened it, the faint scent of cigar smoke and motor oil hit me, a smell as anachronistic as the car itself. "Keys are in the ignition," Frank said, peering through the passenger window. "Who leaves a car like this out here?" I shone my flashlight over the dashboard. The leather seats were worn, but the car was otherwise immaculate. A pair of driving gloves rested on the passenger seat, and an old cassette tape lay half-inserted in the tape deck. Everything about the car screamed vintage, from the analog dials to the manual gear shift. But then my beam caught something etched into the steering wheel, a name, carved jaggedly into the leather, Daniel Harper. "Frank," I said, my voice tight. "You ever hear of a Daniel Harper?" Frank froze. "Harper? Yeah, I know that name. Died in a car crash out here, 30 years ago? Wrecked his ride trying to avoid some kid on a bike. At least, that's what they said." "Why?" I pointed to the steering wheel. Frank's face darkened. "That's not possible." Before I could respond, the radio in the car crackled to life. A burst of static, then a deep, distorted voice, "Help me." Frank and I exchanged a glance, our hands instinctively going to our holsters. "Someone screwing with us," Frank muttered, but his bravado sounded forced. "Dispatch," I said into my radio, "we've got something strange here. Need backup." The response was static. I tried again. Nothing. Frank was fiddling with the cruiser's radio, but it was dead too. The car's engine revved suddenly, making us both jump. The headlights flared, brighter than any I'd ever seen, flooding the road with blinding light. When they dimmed, the landscape around us had changed. The road was gone. The cruiser was gone. We were standing in the middle of a dirt lot surrounded by trees, the skeletal branches reaching toward a blood-red sky. The car's engine rumbled like a growl, and then it started moving, slowly at first, rolling forward like it was testing us. Frank grabbed my arm. "We need to get the hell out of here." "Go where?" I shot back, gesturing at the endless forest that had replaced the highway. The car stopped a few feet ahead, its engine idling, as if it were waiting. Then the passenger door creaked open, and the distorted voice came again, "Get in." "Hell no," Frank said, stepping back, his hand on his gun. But the alternative was worse. The forest was alive with movement now, shadows flitting between the trees, shapes that didn't make sense. Eyes glinted in the dark, dozens of them, watching. Waiting. Against every instinct, I climbed into the driver's seat. The second I touched the wheel, the car roared to life, its headlights cutting through the surreal gloom. Frank hesitated, then cursed under his breath and got in beside me. The car took off, the steering wheel moving under my hands as if guided by an invisible force. The road, or whatever passed for a road here, twisted and buckled, leading us deeper into the forest. The shadows followed, keeping pace with the car, their forms shifting and writhing in ways that made my stomach churn. The voice came again, clearer this time. "They took me. Left me here. You need to see." "See what?" I shouted, my knuckles white on the wheel. But there was no answer. The car screeched to a halt in front of a clearing. In the center was another car, or what was left of it, a twisted wreckage of metal and glass, charred black by fire. The license plate was barely legible, but it was enough to make my blood run cold. "Harper." Frank stepped out first, his flashlight trembling as he approached the wreck. "This is his car," he said. "The one he died in." The shadows closed in, circling the clearing. The air grew thick with the stench of burning rubber and smoke, and the whispers began, low, guttural voices overlapping in a cacophony of pain and anger. I looked back at the muscle car, its headlights now dim, the engine silent. The tape in the deck began to play, a scratchy, haunting tune that sent chills down my spine. Then I saw him. Daniel Harper. Or what was left of him. He stood by the wreck, his form flickering like a dying bulb. His face was twisted, half melted, his eyes hollow sockets that burned with a cold, blue fire. He raised a hand, pointing at the car we'd arrived in. "It's theirs now," he said, his voice echoing in my skull. Just like it was mine. Before I could react, the car roared back to life, its engine screaming. Frank was yelling, but I couldn't hear him over the sound. The last thing I saw was Harper's ghastly face as the car lunged forward, dragging us back into the red haze of the forest. I woke up on Route 17, the sun rising over the horizon. Frank was beside me, pale and shaking, his eyes wide with terror. The cruiser was parked where we'd left it, but the muscle car was gone. No sign of it, no tire tracks, no evidence it had ever been there. But I knew better. I could still hear the whispers, faint and insistent, calling me back. And in the distance, just beyond the tree line, I swore I saw headlights, waiting. Watching.